He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He simply walked across a crowded restaurant, placed his wedding ring on the table in front of his wife, and 6 minutes later, she was in handcuffs. Creed Thompson was 34 years old, and he believed, the way a man believes in gravity, in sunrise, in the solid weight of a promise made before God, that love was enough. He had built something real, a photography studio on Memorial Drive in Atlanta, a 2-story craftsman home in Edgewood, a 5-year-old daughter named Zara who called him Daddy Bear and left crayon drawings of their family on the refrigerator every single morning. He believed his wife Sydney loved him back. He was wrong. And on one cold Thursday night in November, the truth walked straight up to him inside a restaurant called Soul and Vine on Peachtree Road. And it didn't knock first. What Creed didn't know yet was that tonight wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a reckoning 7 years in the making. Let me set the scene for you, because some moments deserve to be seen clearly. It was 7:42 in the evening, the kind of Atlanta November that bites at your collar and makes the city lights blur gold through Rain Street windows. Soul and Vine was packed. White tablecloths, low jazz, the warm amber glow of pendant lights hanging over every booth. The kind of place where people celebrated anniversaries and closed big deals and pretended everything in their lives was exactly as elegant as the wine list suggested. Creed had driven there straight from a photo shoot, a family portrait session over in Decatur that had run 2 hours long because the youngest child refused to smile until someone promised her ice cream. He was still wearing his charcoal button-up, camera bag over one shoulder, tired in that good and honest way a man gets when he's spent the day doing work he loves. He was meeting his business accountant, Marcus, for a quick dinner. Nothing unusual, nothing that signaled the world was about to tilt off its axis. He spotted Marcus near the bar and raised a hand in greeting. That's when his eyes drifted, the way eyes do in a crowded room, just moving across faces and shoulders in candlelight, and landed on a table in the far corner. Table 9. His wife was sitting there. Sydney Thompson, 32 years old, beautiful in that particular way she had, the kind of beauty that made people in restaurants turn their heads. She was wearing the deep burgundy wrap dress she'd bought on their last trip to Savannah. Her hair was perfect. Her smile was warm and wide and radiant. She was not wearing her wedding ring. The man beside her, sincere, had his arm draped across her shoulders like he'd earned the right, like that space had always belonged to him. Creed stood still for what felt like a very long time. His camera bag slipped off his shoulder. He caught it without looking down. His eyes didn't move from that corner table. His heart was doing something complicated inside his chest, not breaking, not yet, but fracturing slowly and quietly, the way ice splits in early March. He thought of Zara, her crayon drawings, her laugh. He thought of 7 years. He set the camera bag on the bar. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, dark blue, worn at the corners, the kind of box that had traveled with him for years. Inside was his own wedding band. He had taken it off that morning to do a clay and water art project with Zara. He'd simply forgotten to put it back on. Something about that detail, the entirely ordinary, accidental detail of a man who'd removed his ring to press clay handprints with his little girl, made what happened next feel almost unbearably sad. Creed walked across the restaurant. Quietly. No raised voice, no dramatic stride, just a tall man in a charcoal shirt moving through candlelight toward a table in the corner, the way you walk towards something you already know is going to hurt. He stopped at table 9. Sydney looked up. For 1/2 second, her face opened with the instinctive smile she'd been giving him for 7 years. And then, something behind her eyes shifted, sharp and cold, the way a curtain falls. Creed placed the velvet box on the polished wood surface. He opened it slowly. He slid the wedding ring across the table toward her. "You're going to need this more than I do," he said quietly. His voice was steady, calm, the voice of a man who had already decided something, even if he didn't yet fully understand what. The restaurant went still. Sydney's wine glass slipped from her fingers and shattered across the floor, the sound cutting through the jazz and the low dinner conversations like a crack of cold lightning. 6 minutes later, police officers in dark jackets walked through the front door of Soul and Vine with an emergency arrest warrant, moved directly to Table 9, and placed Sydney Thompson in handcuffs. As they walked her out past the white tablecloths and the stunned faces and the broken glass still glittering on the floor, she looked back at Creed. Her eyes held something he hadn't seen in a very long time: real fear. And standing there, alone, in the warm amber light of that restaurant, Creed Thompson understood, with a cold and terrible clarity, that this was never just an affair. And what he was about to discover would shake him to his very foundation. Because the woman he had called his wife had been running a plan that went far deeper and far darker than anyone in that room could have imagined. Here is something most people don't understand about betrayal. It doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in pieces, small, quiet pieces. A text message you weren't meant to see, a bank statement that doesn't add up, a laugh that sounds just slightly wrong. And by the time you've collected enough pieces to understand the shape of what you're holding, you realize you've been living inside a lie for years. Creed Thompson understood that now, but understanding it didn't make it any easier to breathe. After the police escorted Sydney out of Soul and Vine, Creed remained seated across from Sincere. The restaurant had settled back into its low conversations, the way people do when a spectacle ends and the embarrassment of having witnessed something private settles back into their dinner plates. Sincere looked at him, not with guilt, not with shame, but with the tired relief of a man who has been carrying a secret so long that releasing it feels almost like setting down a heavy coat. "You should know what she did," Sincere said. "Not for her sake, for yours." And then he told him everything. Over the past 14 months, Sydney had quietly and methodically transferred the lease agreements for Creed's photography studio on Memorial Drive and his fashion warehouse out in College Park, both into Sincere's name, with paperwork bearing Creed's forged signature. She had moved just over $300,000 from their joint company accounts into personal accounts linked solely to Creed, building a paper trail that pointed directly at him. Counterfeit goods had been sold and documented entirely under his identity. Sincere leaned forward, his voice dropping low. "She was building a cage around you, and she was going to lock the door and walk away with the key." He paused, then, almost reluctantly, "She had less than 48 hours before she was going to disappear. She told me last week she was almost done." Creed drove home through the rain. The Edgewood house looked the same as always, porch light on, the old oak in the front yard dripping with water, Zara's purple tricycle parked crooked against the garage door because she always forgot to straighten it. He sat in the driveway for a long moment with the engine off, listening to rain drum on the roof of his truck. He went inside. In the living room, the one Sydney had always called the room with bad energy and refused to furnish properly for 3 straight years, he noticed 2 large duffel bags partially hidden behind the old armchair in the corner. He unzipped the first one. Neatly bundled cash, stacks of it wrapped in rubber bands. The second bag held 4 fake passports, his name on each one. But the photographs attached to them belonged to a man he had never seen before, someone else's face wearing his identity like a mask. There was also a burner phone, one message on it, sent from an unknown number 3 days prior. If he gets suspicious before the accounts close, Plan B, tell people he hurt you. cry. Use the old photos. Creed read it twice. He set the phone down very carefully, the way you set down something fragile, not because you're gentle, but because you don't trust your own hands if they start shaking. He sat down on the bare floor and put his face in his hands. Not because he was weak, but because a man can only absorb so much truth in a single evening before his body simply demands a moment to catch up with his mind. At exactly 1:17 in the morning, someone knocked on the front door. A woman stood on the porch in the rain, no umbrella, soaking wet, with the wide-eyed expression of someone who has decided to do something terrifying because the alternative is far worse. Her name was Reagan. She had been Sydney's underground accountant for 2 years, quietly managing the financial architecture of Sydney's hidden operation. She was 37 years old and looked like she hadn't slept in a week. "She doesn't just want to disappear," Reagan said, without so much as a greeting. "She wants you out of the picture entirely, Creed. There's a $2 million life insurance policy on you. Once you're gone, she collects it and vanishes." She pressed a USB drive into his hand. "Everything is on there. Account transfers, forged documents, communications, all of it." She turned to leave, then stopped at the edge of the porch. "One more thing." She still didn't look at him directly. She told Sincere she could use Zara as leverage if things went sideways. Her exact words were, "My wife material right there. He'll do anything to protect that little girl. That makes her useful." Reagan's voice tightened. She was quoting herself, like it was clever. Then she disappeared back into the dark and the rain. Creed stood alone on that porch with a USB drive in his fist. The woman he had married, the woman who had held their newborn daughter 5 years ago and wept with what he'd believed was pure joy, had looked at that same child and seen a tool. Later that night, long after midnight, he sat at the kitchen table, going through a shared cloud drive he had never thought to examine closely. Mixed among years of family photos, birthday parties, a beach trip to Tybee Island, Zara in a yellow swimsuit, all 3 of them sunburned and laughing, were documents that turned his stomach cold. Fabricated psychological evaluations, filed through a community mental health clinic in Buckhead. Reports describing Creed Thompson as volatile, controlling, and emotionally dangerous. Signed off by a counselor he had never once met. Creed pressed both hands flat on the table. He stared at those documents for a long time. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked the empty kitchen the question that would haunt him for weeks. Was I actually harmful to my family? Or was all of this manufactured? The uncertainty that followed, that quiet, devastating self-doubt, was perhaps the cruelest thing Sydney had done to him. Not the money, not the fraud, not even the affair. The fact that she had made him question his own goodness. Then came another knock at the door. 2 men, dark jackets, badges on their belts. Creed reached for his phone to call Reagan, and she beat him to it, her voice tight with urgency. "Don't open that door. Those are not legitimate officers." Creed slipped out the back. Reagan picked him up 2 blocks away, and they drove through pouring rain for nearly 2 hours, south on I-20, then east into the back roads outside Covington, Georgia, until they reached an old lakeside cabin that had belonged to Creed's grandfather. Cedar walls, creaking floors, a single overhead bulb that buzzed faintly when the wind picked up, a porch looking out over Lake Varner, black and still under the storm. It was not comfortable, but it was safe. And in the days that followed, hidden away in that cabin while storms rolled over the water and the truth kept coming in waves, Creed Thompson was about to uncover the darkest layer of all. There is a particular kind of darkness that settles in when you are hiding. Not the darkness of a room with the lights off, but the darkness of a man who has lost his home, his sense of safety, and is no longer entirely sure he recognizes the life he's been living. Over the next 4 days inside that cedar cabin at Lake Varner, beneath a buzzing kitchen light and the constant percussion of rain on the tin roof, Creed and Reagan worked through everything on the USB drive. It was methodical. It was merciless. Reagan had spent 3 years as Sydney's bookkeeper. She knew where every dollar lived. Every hidden account was registered. Every shell company had been incorporated, several of them through a Delaware LLC where the paperwork, as always, was clean. Sydney's paperwork was always immaculate. She planned for every possible version of this, Reagan said one night, a mug of cold coffee forgotten beside her laptop. Every version except one. Which one? Creed asked. The one where I decided I was done. On the 3rd day, Creed's cousin Isaiah arrived at the cabin. Isaiah was 36 years old, polished, wire-rimmed glasses, the particular calm of someone who has learned to set his feelings in a separate room while the work gets done. He worked for the Georgia Department of Justice in their cybercrime division and had driven down from Marietta the moment Creed called. He brought laptops, an external hard drive, and a signal scrambler that Creed didn't fully understand and wisely didn't ask about. He set everything out on the kitchen table with quiet efficiency. "All right," Isaiah said. "Let's go get her." What came next required patience, the kind that, when you're living inside it, feels almost physically painful. With Isaiah's technical expertise, Creed and Reagan quietly installed 3 hidden cameras inside the Edgewood house, one in the living room, one covering the kitchen, and one in the hallway near the spare room. Sydney had been released on temporary bail while the initial charges were being processed. They knew she would return. People like Sydney always returned to check on the pieces of their plans. They didn't have to wait long. On the 4th night, at 11:48 p.m., the laptop screen showed Sydney slipping through the side door of the house with the easy confidence of someone who has never truly feared consequences. She moved room to room with a small flashlight, opening drawers, checking the loose floorboard in the hallway Creed hadn't known she was aware of, rifling through documents with gloved hands. She worked quickly and without hesitation. She was smiling, not nervously, not with the fractured smile of a woman who was afraid or conflicted or relieved to be back. A satisfied smile. The private, unhurried expression of someone reviewing a plan they are proud of. She paused in the living room, looked around at the family photos, at Zara's drawing still pinned to the corkboard by the door, at the small shelf where Creed kept his most important prints. Then she said it out loud, to no one, to the empty house, in the voice of a woman entirely comfortable with her own certainty. Creed is kind in all the right ways, and too trusting to see it coming. He's still hoping my wife will come back. That's what makes him so easy. She laughed softly at her own observation. And the 3 people watching her from 40 miles away in that cabin said nothing at all. Because some things land in silence. Then her phone lit up with a video call. She answered. Zara's face appeared on the screen. 5 years old, wearing her butterfly pajamas, clutching the small stuffed elephant she'd slept with since she was an infant. It was past midnight. Creed's aunt, who had been staying with Zara, had clearly not anticipated the call. Sydney's entire presence shifted in under a second. Every trace of the coldness vanished. Warmth poured in, golden, immediate, completely convincing. "Baby girl," she said gently, "Mommy misses you so much. Are you being good for Auntie?" Zara nodded, blinking sleepily, clutching Gerald the elephant to her chest. Then her small face scrunched with the intense, unfiltered sincerity that belongs only to very young children and very old people. "Mommy, is Daddy a bad guy? You said I should be careful, but Daddy makes me cheesy eggs. Bad guys don't make cheesy eggs." Sydney's smile held for a moment, then flickered, just for an instant, before repairing itself into something smooth and reassuring. "Get some sleep, sweetheart. Mommy will talk to you very soon. She ended the call. Back in the cabin, Creed sat with his hands folded on the table, very still. Isaiah turned away and pressed his hand over his mouth. Reagan looked out at the black water of the lake. Zara's voice, "Is Daddy a bad guy?" had the quality of a wound with a clean entry point. No immediate pain, then it opens all the way. Creed's shoulders came forward. He cried, the quiet, controlled kind of crying that comes when a man has decided he will not break, but the grief still needs somewhere to go. Isaiah put a hand on his shoulder and kept it there. Nobody spoke for a long time. Then Creed wiped his face, straightened up, and looked at Isaiah. "She used our daughter as a tool," he said quietly. "That is the last thing she gets to use against me." He picked up his phone. He called Sydney. She answered on the second ring. Her voice shifted immediately, tears arriving with practiced precision, reaching straight for the most familiar words in their shared history. "You promised you would do anything for me and Zara. You promised." Creed recognized what she was doing. He had seen her perform this particular scene many times over 7 years. He had always responded to it. He had always softened. Not this time. He kept his voice level. He asked careful questions. He stayed on the phone for 19 minutes. He kept her talking. The entire conversation was recorded. And as the call ended, Creed finally understood the deepest layer of what Sydney had constructed. She wasn't simply running from him. She wasn't just having an affair or committing fraud. She was running from a far larger criminal network she had become deeply entangled with. People who had decided she was more of a risk than an asset. She had needed an exit strategy clean enough to close every open file behind her. She had chosen Creed as that strategy. His name, his identity, his goodness and his blind trust, all of it pressed into service as the exit door for a woman who had never, for a single day, looked at their marriage and seen anything other than an arrangement. He set his phone face down on the table, looked at Isaiah. "How quickly can you get us in front of the FBI?" Isaiah was already typing. What Creed was about to see on that USB drive, a video Sydney had recorded alone in her studio, would strip away every remaining illusion and leave an entire federal courtroom without words. There is a point in certain kinds of pain where the individual blows stop registering separately, not because they stop landing, but because the whole body goes quiet, the way an open field goes quiet before a storm. And you find yourself watching your own life with a strange, detached clarity, as if it belongs to someone else, and you are only a witness. Creed Thompson had reached that point. He was sitting alone in the cabin on the 5th night. Reagan and Isaiah were both asleep. Outside, the lake lay flat and motionless under a sky finally clearing after days of relentless rain. The stars were beginning to show, faint and distant through the trees. On the kitchen counter, Reagan had left her handgun. Left it the way people leave keys and coffee mugs, without thinking about what it means. He hadn't touched it. But he'd been looking at it for a while. He thought about Zara, about what her life might look like growing up inside the shadow of all this, about whether a little girl deserved to be spared the weight of a father who had been this thoroughly taken apart. He reached instead for the box of old photos he'd brought from the house. He fed most of them into the fireplace. Wedding portraits, anniversary dinners, years of carefully framed images of a marriage that had, apparently, never fully existed anywhere but inside his own belief in it. He watched them burn. But he kept one photograph, a Polaroid, slightly creased, from a Sunday afternoon at Piedmont Park 2 summers ago. All 3 of them on a blanket in the afternoon sun. Zara was between them, arms stretched wide, caught mid-laugh, her eyes squeezed shut with the pure physical joy of a child who is entirely and completely at home in the world. He looked at that photo for a long time. Then he set the gun across the room, well out of reach, and he held the photo with both hands and said quietly to the empty cabin, "I cannot fall apart. My little girl needs a strong father." That was the moment everything changed direction. Not with a declaration or a dramatic resolution, just a man alone by a dying fire, making a decision so quiet it barely disturbed the air around him. He was going to stand back up, and he was going to stay standing. On the morning of the 6th day, Isaiah closed his laptop very slowly. "Creed," he said, "come sit down." What Isaiah had found was the architecture beneath all the other architecture. Over the past 2 years, Sydney had been working alongside a criminal network that extended well beyond Atlanta. People connected to counterfeit goods distribution, document fraud, and money laundering across 3 states. She had entered the arrangement as a participant, risen to partner, and at some point in the past 18 months, become a liability they wanted to quietly remove. Sydney had responded the way she always responded to being cornered. She made a plan. She would vanish. But she needed to vanish clean, with money, with freedom, with Zara, and without any investigative thread left dangling that might eventually find her. To do that, she needed a story, a crime. A credible, fully documented criminal who would absorb every open file and redirect every resource away from her. She had selected Creed, her loyal, devoted, camera bag-carrying husband, who still left her coffee on the counter every morning and spent his Sundays making cheesy eggs for their daughter, and had never once, not once in 7 years, imagined that the woman beside him was using his name as the foundation of an escape plan. She had a staged car accident already arranged, Isaiah said, his voice carefully even. The mechanic had been paid, the route was mapped, the timing was set. Once you were either detained by federal charges or no longer around, she would collect the $2 million life insurance policy, activate the fake passports, and leave the country with Zara under assumed names. He slid a folder across the table. Passport copies, 3 offshore bank accounts in different names, a detailed day-by-day timeline stretching back 11 months, and a photograph. Sydney, smiling, standing in front of a residential building in Miami's Brickell neighborhood, dated 8 months earlier. She had already picked out where she was going. She had already chosen their new names. She had been saying goodbye for nearly a year without him knowing. The video was the last file on the USB drive. Isaiah had opened it alone first before calling the others in. He played it once. Then he came to the doorway of the back room where Creed was sitting with his coffee and said simply, "You need to see this, both of you." The footage was studio quality, soft lighting, clean focus, the kind of deliberate visual composition that comes from someone who genuinely understands cameras. Sydney had set this up herself. She was sitting alone inside her photography studio on Auburn Avenue, no jewelry, hair pinned back simply. She looked directly into the lens without blinking. What followed was not a private confession made in a moment of weakness. It was something closer to a record, a documentation she had made for reasons that felt, as she spoke, almost like pride. "I used to think my wife material was about what a man wanted," she said, her voice composed and almost amused. "Turns out it's about who's useful." She smiled. Then she described, clearly, directly, without hesitation, the full financial structure she had built. Every account transfer, every forged signature, every shell company. The $1.2 million funneled into accounts bearing Creed's name, designed to ensure that if anything unraveled before she could disappear, Creed Thompson would face federal charges so thoroughly documented that no defense attorney in Georgia could dig him out. She had prepared for every possible outcome. Except this one. The video ended. The three of them sat in the pale morning light of that cabin kitchen and did not speak. There was nothing to say that the footage hadn't already made perfectly clear, because they were no longer looking at a wife who had chosen another man. They were not looking at a woman who had made terrible decisions in a failing marriage. They were looking at a recording of someone who had examined a kind and devoted human being, the father of her child, and seen only a resource to be deployed and discarded, without a trace of uncertainty, without a single moment of doubt. Creed stood up. He walked to the cabin door and opened it, and stood on the porch in the cool morning air, looking out over the lake. The water was silver in the early light, perfectly still. A heron stood at the far bank, patient, motionless, watching. Reagan came and stood beside him after a moment. "What do we do now?" she asked. Creed watched the heron for a long moment. Then he turned back inside, sat down at the table, and opened his phone. "We make one call," he said. That call, placed to a specific contact of Isaiah's inside the Atlanta field office of the FBI, set the final act in motion. Sydney Thompson was about to discover that the man she had built a 7-year plan around had spent the last 6 days quietly and completely dismantling everything she'd constructed, piece by careful piece. And what happened next at Gate C of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport would leave an entire federal courtroom without a single word to say. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, on a Tuesday morning in December, is one of the busiest places on Earth. Thousands of people moving in every direction, rolling suitcases clicking across polished floors, departure announcements echoing overhead. The particular purposeful noise that fills a space where everyone is going somewhere and no one is paying close attention to anyone else. Sydney Thompson had planned for exactly that. She understood that airports were organized chaos, and that chaos was the best kind of cover. She had dressed carefully, muted colors, minimal jewelry, her hair tucked under a wide-brimmed hat. Zara walked beside her, holding her hand, wearing the yellow backpack shaped like a sunflower that Creed had bought for her 4th birthday. Sydney had 2 rolling suitcases and a carry-on. The fake passports identified them as a mother and daughter flying to the Cayman Islands for a family holiday. She had made it all the way to Gate C. She was 12 minutes from boarding when the federal agents moved in. 4 of them, plain clothes, approaching from separate angles through the crowd with the unhurried precision of people who have done this before. Isaiah had coordinated with the Atlanta field office for 3 full days. The federal arrest warrant had been signed the previous evening. Sydney saw them one moment before they reached her, and in that moment, all the extraordinary, disciplined composure she had maintained across 14 months of careful planning finally came apart. She dropped to her knees on the airport floor, and she screamed. Not in genuine fear, in performance. Sydney's final and most desperate performance. "Help me! Somebody please help me!" Her voice rang through the terminal. Travelers stopped and turned. "I am escaping a dangerous situation. My children are at risk. Please, someone!" She was reaching for Zara. Her eyes were wide and full of tears. She looked to every stranger who turned toward her in that moment, like a woman in genuine crisis. Several passengers took uncertain steps toward the approaching agents. Creed was standing 15 feet away. He had come, against the practical advice of everyone who cared about him, because he needed to witness this. Not to confront Sydney, not to say another word to her, simply to see it. The final act. The last performance of a show that had run 7 years too long. He stood still while the crowd turned and looked at him with confusion and quiet suspicion. He felt the old current move through him, that cold, practiced self-doubt that Sydney had spent years installing. What if they believe her? What if they look at me and see exactly what she wanted them to see? He stood still. 1 hour later, in a federal courtroom on Ted Turner Drive in downtown Atlanta, an emergency hearing was convened. The room was full. Agents, attorneys, a judge, support staff who had expected a routine bail modification. It was not that. The confession video was presented. Within 4 minutes of it beginning, no one in that courtroom was looking at a phone or reviewing paperwork. Every eye was on the screen mounted above the witness stand. Sydney's voice filled the room. She described the financial structure she had built, the accounts she had loaded with funds under Creed's name, the fabricated documentation designed to make him look like the architect of every crime she had committed. She spoke about it in a tone that was measured and precise, the tone of someone reporting on a project they completed successfully. The judge's expression did not change, but her pen went still on the notepad in front of her. A court officer shifted his weight quietly. At the defense table, Sydney sat with her hands folded in her lap. Her attorney had instructed her not to react. She was doing her best, but when her own voice reached the section about the $1.2 million, when her words described the full scope of the financial framing she had constructed specifically to destroy the man she had stood beside in a white dress 7 years ago, Sydney Thompson's hands began to tremble. Because for the first time across all of this, her own meticulous words were working entirely against her. Every transfer documented, every manipulation time-stamped, every calculated move described in her own voice, in her own studio, in footage she had recorded herself and which had traveled through Reagan's courage and a USB drive pressed into a grieving man's hand in the middle of a rainstorm, directly into a federal courtroom. When the video ended, the room was completely silent. Sydney's attorney leaned in and whispered something. She did not respond. She was looking at Creed. He was seated in the gallery, very still, hands folded in his lap, expression quiet and composed. He was not glaring at her. He was not performing satisfaction. He was simply looking at her the way a man looks when something long and exhausting is finally, irreversibly over. Sydney looked away first. The sentencing came 8 weeks later, 22 years in federal prison. Wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to commit murder, child endangerment, obstruction of justice. Creed was not in the courtroom that day. He was at home in Edgewood, sitting at the kitchen table with Zara, helping her glue cotton balls onto a construction paper snow cloud for a school project. She had craft glue on her cheek and the focused expression she always made when something required her full attention. Brows down, bottom lip pushed out slightly. "Daddy, does a cloud have one cotton ball or lots of cotton balls?" she asked. "Lots," Creed said. "Clouds are made from millions of tiny pieces all holding together." She considered this with great seriousness and applied 7 more cotton balls to her paper. When his phone buzzed with Isaiah's message, "Done, 22 years," Creed read it, set the phone face down, and went back to the snow cloud. Because some moments don't need to be announced. Some justice is quiet. It settles in like the feeling you get when you've been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and someone finally comes and lifts it away. Before she entered witness protection, Reagan left a handwritten letter on Creed's doorstep, tucked inside a plain envelope with his name written in careful block letters. "Some people never get a second chance. You do. Live for your daughter, and help the people still trapped the way we once were." Creed read it twice, folded it, and placed it in the drawer beside the Piedmont Park Polaroid. What came next for Creed Thompson, and for the little girl with the cotton ball cloud, was something that even the darkest chapters of this story couldn't have predicted. 6 months later, Creed Thompson woke up at 6:30 in the morning. This was not a dramatic awakening. No cinematic sunrise, no swelling music, no sudden revelation. It was just an ordinary Tuesday in May in Decatur, Georgia. Birds going at it outside the window, pale light coming in sideways through the curtains. The comfortable domestic quiet of a house not yet fully awake. He got up, made coffee, pulled the egg carton from the refrigerator and the shredded cheddar from the cheese drawer. At 6:47, small footsteps came padding down the hall. Zara appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing one sock. She could never manage to keep track of both. Her hair in two lopsided puffs, holding Gerald, the stuffed elephant, in the crook of her elbow. She looked at the stove. She looked at her father. "Cheesy eggs?" she asked. "Cheesy eggs," Creed confirmed. She climbed into her chair and watched him cook with the patient proprietary satisfaction of someone who has placed an order and is completely confident it will arrive correctly. This was their morning. This was what they had built. Not from something grand or perfect or untouched by pain, but from a decision made beside a dying fire in a cabin at Lake Varner, by a man who chose to stay. Isaiah spent 6 weeks working to fully restore what Sydney had dismantled. He erased the fabricated psychological evaluations, legally corrected the financial records, restored the studio lease agreements, and cleared Creed's name with complete federal documentation. It was not fast work. Nothing in the legal system is fast. But it was thorough, and it held. Creed eventually sold the Edgewood house. Some spaces carry too much of what happened inside them. Better to begin on new ground. He moved to a quieter neighborhood in Decatur, closer to extended family. Creed's aunt, who had kept Zara safe through all of it, lived 4 blocks away. She came over for dinner on Thursdays and always brought a sweet potato pie that Zara demolished in approximately 8 minutes. The new photography studio opened on East Ponce de Leon Avenue in early spring. He named it Resilience Portraits. The focus was community storytelling, documenting families within the Black community of Metro Atlanta, grandmothers with grandchildren, fathers who had come through hard years, young couples just beginning, elders who had lived whole lifetimes in these neighborhoods and whose faces carried the kind of history that deserved to be recorded carefully and with full respect. He was good at it. He had always been good at it. Nothing that had happened had taken that from him. Word spread the way word spreads in close communities, quietly, person to person, through church bulletins and Saturday conversations at the DeKalb Farmers Market and neighborhood group chats that someone's grandmother somehow always managed to find. People came in a little uncertain and left with photographs that made them look at their own lives with something approaching tenderness. One afternoon, a man arrived for a session with his 2 teenage sons. During the consultation, he sat with his hands folded on the table and said, with the careful voice of someone who has rehearsed a difficult sentence, "I heard what happened to you. I went through something similar. There were days I didn't think I would come out the other side." Creed looked at him for a moment. "But you did," he said. The man nodded. "Barely." "Then that's the part of the story worth telling," Creed said. He began speaking at community support groups, not as a professional with credentials on a wall, but as a man who had been through something real and was standing on the other side of it. He talked about the self-doubt, about the cabin and the long night by the fire, about the question that had haunted him for weeks, "Was I the problem?" And about how he had finally, through honest work with a therapist over in Kirkwood, arrived at the answer he needed. No, he had been a good man who had been systematically taught by someone exceptionally skilled at that particular kind of teaching to doubt his own goodness. That is not the same thing as being wrong. Knowing the difference, feeling it in your body, not just your mind, had taken time, but it had come. Some nights, strange messages still appeared on his phone. "I'm still watching you." He read them, set the phone face down, did not lie awake. Because the man who had once shaped every decision around fear, who had bent his own understanding of reality to fit inside the story someone else was telling about him, that man was gone. Every night before Zara fell asleep, Creed held her close and said the same thing, gently, like a reminder meant as much for himself as for her. Daddy went through a lot of pain, but pain did not stop me. It taught me what truly matters: trusting the right people, staying strong, and loving you with everything I have. Zara usually fell asleep before he finished. That was fine. She would understand when she was older, and by then, she would have an entire life in front of her, built by a father who had faced the worst and chosen to stay. This story teaches us 3 things worth sitting with. First, love without observation is not devotion, it is vulnerability. The people who hurt us most are rarely strangers. They are the ones we stopped watching closely because we trusted them completely. From now on, pay attention. Not with suspicion, but with the quiet awareness of someone who has earned the right to know the difference between a genuine smile and a practiced one. Second, when someone dismantles your sense of reality, makes you question your own memory, your own goodness, your own mind, that is not a personal failing. That is a specific kind of harm that has a name. If you recognize it in your own life, or in the life of a son, a grandson, a neighbor down the street, do not wait. Write down what you observe, date it, put it in a plain envelope in the kitchen drawer beside the takeout menus. Evidence kept quietly is dignity protected. Third, the children watching us survive are learning something they will carry for the rest of their lives. Every morning you get up and make breakfast anyway. That is the lesson. Not the words, the breakfast. Creed Thompson didn't rebuild his life by finding a grand new purpose. He rebuilt it one cheesy egg at a time. That is enough. That has always been enough. This story was written by a human with AI as a companion. It was born from a simple wish: to awaken the belief that kindness still exists, and no matter how many trials life brings, there are always moments of justice and quiet miracles waiting for those who deserve them. Production team, story and screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Nguyen. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Nguyen. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life. Production team, story and screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Nguyen. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Nguyen. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life.